Oh, really?
Mhm.
Greetings, everyone. This is JKO Serie coming to you live from Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm excited to have this discussion with some fine people on the panel. I have Dr. Paul Easterling, and I have Madam Eswari, Kalugasalam. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
And Dr. Serie McDougal also just joined us, and we're going to be talking about cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. I think it's a very important subject for us to talk about, given our racialized world. What does it even mean to begin with? And the panel that we have, they're going to be sharing a few things from their own personal experiences. And I also welcome them to be bold enough to go ahead and tell us the way they see the world and how we should act appropriately. So let me start by asking Dr. Serie McDougal, what is, in your understanding, cultural appropriation?
Well, thank you again for the invitation to be on the show and for the question. But and my understanding of cultural appropriation is when one group borrows like an element or some aspect of another group's culture and or adopts it and does so outside of context. Often they exaggerate or distort it based on what that group means in their mind. Often one aspect of it is that they do it without giving credit to the people who produce that culture. And another aspect of cultural appropriation is that it's done in a context where the culture bearer, the culture producers are systematically disempowered. And I think that when you add those qualities to it, it becomes cultural appropriation rather than just simple, what human beings do, observe and borrow different aspects of culture. But with those elements, turns it into something different, where people are being fetishized and culturally oppressed.
Thank you for that. Dr. Paul Easterling, do you have anything to add to that? Cultural appropriation.
No, Dr. McDougal's definition is pretty straightforward, and I think the point of it is taking something that is not yours and like wearing it for using someone else's culture as a costume. And a lot of times, or most times, I would argue is to the detriment of the people that is the culture is being borrowed from. Definitely.
Okay. So let's think about this then. Okay, I have a friend who is European American, and he reached out to me and said, "Look, I've read through Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa is a celebration developed by an African American, Dr. Karenga, and it has some great values." And he told me, he said, "Look, I love Kwanzaa. I love the values of Kwanzaa align with my family's values. Is it okay if I practice Kwanzaa, if I celebrate Kwanzaa?" He asked that, and he was genuine in his intentions. So, and I told him, I think you can enjoy Kwanzaa. So I mean, I want to get your thoughts on that.
For your friend, it seems that's more in the realm of appreciation than appropriation. That's what it sounds like. And I don't know your friend, but from your description, it sounds like he's appreciating the culture rather than trying to appropriate it. He just wants to practice it, make it a part of his life. That by itself is fine. But taking it out of its context and trying to make it yours without giving credit to the culture that it comes from, kind of like, what's the word? I don't want to call it stealing, but or plagiarism, but for appropriation is definitely in that realm. But for what it sounds like, your friend sounds like he's just appreciating it.
So I have a thought on this.
Let me invite
Yeah.
Eswari. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So Kalu, you know this, but I was born and bred in Malaysia. In Malaysia, we have three distinct races. We have the Malays, we have the Chinese, and we have the Indians, just like me. Our ancestors are from my ancestors are from India, and some of my the community comes from China. But over a period of time, we have borrowed each other's cultures that sometimes we don't even know where it came from because we have been so integrated. So for example, I'm going to give an example of the when the during the Chinese New Year festival, we celebrate with they give the red packet containing money, right? So then the Malays is they use the same concept, but they use a different color. The Malays mostly in Malaysia are Muslims, and then the Indians use the same thing, but they use it in a different color. So it's for us, it has become so much part of our culture that, and I think that because we were raised in that kind of community and that kind of background, when anyone comes to us, it's we wear each other's costumes, or rather attire. We have days that we have tomorrow we're going to dress up in Cheongsam, so all of us come to work in Cheongsam. So we don't think of it as appropriation. And I also understand where you're coming from, in the sense that does the other party in which is the culture is appropriated from feels oppressed? It's if at all there's no oppression, then I feel that there is no cultural appropriation. That's my thought in this.
That's a good contribution. So, and I like the examples you also gave, and I think the example also supports, in a sense, Dr. Serie McDougal's definition. I say the underlying factor here seems to me that if there is oppression, historical oppression, or even oppression in the present going on, then there lies cultural appropriation. Okay. Now, let's talk about hair, for example, because I want us to give some concrete examples about these things so that people can actually walk away with some things and they could use in society, right? After this discussion, hair is a big deal. We know in the state of Nebraska, for example, there's some moves to ban braids and the way Africans wear their hair, not just in Nebraska, but throughout the US. All right, there's been legislation, there've been policies, even companies are saying, oh, you can't, this is not professional to have your hair braided. It's not professional. But then we know that there've been situations where European Americans rocked, if I may use that term, braided hair. It's appreciated. It's like, oh, wow, this is so beautiful, right? You heard of the Boderic, right? You have folks in the fashion area where they rock these hairs. It was almost like they invented it. Now, what are your take? I'll be curious to hear Eswari's thought on this. But before I hear Eswari's thought, Dr. McDougal, what's your take on that? And how should we move forward when it comes to hair?
I mean, I think there's the Crown Act. It's the most current kind of things on the matter. I think the legislation that bans discrimination based on ethnic styled hair, and it's just an example that there's this situation once again where people are making cultural choices, but they're making them in the context of an uneven distribution of power. So where someone make a cultural choice to wear their hair a certain way, they risk being denied access to opportunities. And yes, other people will be able to borrow those things, but the styles that they see Black women wear who are entertainers or who are people who are high profile, but they don't have to face the same kinds of discrimination based on their hair that Black women do outside of the being on screen, you know? So that's where they get to do it, and they do it. I just wanted to add that cultural appropriation doesn't necessarily need to require maliciousness or intent because it's institutionalized. So it doesn't have to be intentional, you know, it doesn't have to be in spite, in my view, you know, respectfully.
Thank you, thank you. And I'm skipping you, Dr. Easterly, because you don't have any say in this matter. You don't have hair. So, I'm going to Eswari. Eswari, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's interesting what Dr. McDougal was saying, because as I mentioned to you, Kalu, prior to one of my prior to this, was that I am fascinated by the Black culture and the African American culture, and this and again, this is because, like, you know, I grew up in Malaysia, and at that point in time when I first went to the UK to study, I have not seen anyone who came from who had an African ancestry. So, you know, it's like the first time that I met a person, and he was in my class, and I was just sitting next to him, and I was just fascinated by his hair, you know, because I've never seen such kind of hair before in my life. And I was all of like 18 years old, and this was before internet and Facebook, so you can have an understanding as to how old I am. But so I asked him whether is it okay for me to touch his hair, you know, and he said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So fast forward many years later, I visited some countries in Africa, and I started developing friendships with Africans and someone of African American background. And then when I was in a professional setting back in Malaysia, there were this bunch of like Nigerian students who were helping us with some of the events. And I was looking at them, and I went up to them to tell them that their hair was absolutely beautiful. Their hair was braided. And they said that if you wanted, we can do your hair that way. And then I said, do you really would do that for me? And they said, yes. So, and they invited me to their house, and I spent about 6 hours getting my hair braided by them, right? And I came back. I remember that, you know, I wore that hair for about 2 weeks. And then I realized that it was really causing a lot of tension in my head because I'm not used to it. So it's like, you know, I went into work that way, and in a country like Malaysia, where it's like, you know, anything that's not Malaysia, Chinese, or Indian is foreign, you know, I stood out for that reason. And people actually, like, because of my features too, a lot of them didn't think that I was local because of the hair that I was wearing. But yeah, so it's like, you know, and I appreciated the work that they went in to go and like create that hair that was like so natural for them. And when I moved to the States, I was shocked that women were not allowed to wear their hair the way they wanted to, you know. But then at the same time, but I was like thinking to myself, I was very happy that, you know, my Nigerian friends shared with me this particular aspect of their culture. And I became very cautious of wanting to share that picture on social media because the landscape is very different here. And I do not want to inadvertently cause some ruckus and cause chaos, you know. And I pulled down that picture from my Facebook because I didn't want to be that person to be seen as appropriating somebody else's culture.
I want to bring you in, Dr. Easterling. Could you comment on that personal experience of Eswari's? And also, can you also comment on the fact that this idea of cultural appropriation may vary from continent to continent, from region to region? Is that how we should go about it? Should we be mindful of the different societies, or should we just say, look, if I'm comfortable rocking this hair in Malaysia, I should be fine doing it in the US. I'm still the same person. So could you comment on that? And I bring you in, Dr. McDougal.
Yeah, I think it is very important to recognize exactly where you're at. Something that works in Malaysia might not work in America because of historical and cultural circumstances. And it is important for us to pay attention to that. And on the other side of it, it's important for us to, and I'm speaking about African Americans, to recognize a person who may be not from this context who maybe doesn't know, and take the opportunity to educate that person or to fill them in on his history and the problems with that history, rather than just jumping on somebody and saying you can't do that. Take the opportunity to teach, and hopefully that person will take that opportunity as well to learn. But I do think that context matters. So something that won't fly in the United States might go, it might be fine in Malaysia. And that's different cultural context. And it's important for us to recognize each cultural context when we're in it, to understand exactly where we are culturally.
I'm gonna ask a direct question because I think you touched upon that, Dr. Easterling, to Dr. McDougal. In the US, a Chinese rocks that hair that Eswari just described in the US. Is that cultural appropriation or is that appreciation? A Chinese person, right? Well, I know we have to be nuanced, but I'd like for us to be as broad as possible so that people can again walk away and say, okay, this is what it really means to culturally appropriate. Because it seems like the story that shared from the context, she was appreciating that of Africa in her community, and it was beautiful. And frankly speaking, I also, wow, that's amazing, Eswari. Thanks for doing that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you were going in and out a little bit. Could you repeat, please?
A Chinese grade US, is that cultural appreciation? Dr. McDougal, you are on mute.
Okay, so I think I understand the question. If a Chinese person wears the hairstyle, I think it sounded like plaits. Was it plaits? Like braids or something? It doesn't matter.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
classic cornrows or even locks.
It doesn't matter what it. Yeah. So, okay, a Chinese person wears it. Is it a cultural appropriation? I personally think I would like to know more of the context, but I would just say that it's those factors. Is it that we mentioned in the beginning, like the context, how it's being used, or and how that person is, the context that how people of African descent are being treated in that, or being seen in that mind, that all of those things matter to me, at least. So there's a kind of a thin line when you do that and like fetishizing something or someone, that kind of like borderline violation of personal space, and it just gets, we just have too long a history. It's too long a history. I don't know. I kind of want to know what other people think. That's a little, to me, I need to know more context, but I'd like to hear what other people think. I'm sorry, I'm not having more of a clear, direct response to that.
If I can jump in as well, I think it's an issue of power, and that is to say plainly, if I see a Chinese person trying to rock a African American style, whether as opposed to a white person I see trying to rock the style, then the conversation of power changes, because the Chinese person doesn't have the same type of power that a European American does. And so that's where that changes the conversation for me. It doesn't come necessarily an issue of appropriation, it becomes an issue of appreciation. And the first thing I thought about, especially bringing in the Chinese culture, was Wu-Tang Clan, right? Wu-Tang Clan comes in and they infuse a lot of Chinese culture into hip hop music. And there was never really a conversation of appropriation. It was all about appreciation, because we see two different cultures that have appreciation for each other kind of talking back and forth. Whereas if you had a European in the mix, it changes the conversation, because the dynamic of power changes at that point. That's my little sense on that.
May I add something? Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead. Please go ahead.
Sorry, Dr. McDougal. So I just have this point to make. So what if, going back to the example of what Kalu was saying earlier, if this Chinese person grew up in an environment which was predominantly Black, and so they were very much influenced by the society that they grew up in, and therefore it is part of their own culture too. So it's like, but if you move them away from that scenario, then everyone else who do not know them, obviously not everybody's going to ask you questions. It's like, why do you do this? It's like, I'm going to be mad with you because of that. So in these circumstances, then it's like, in their own community, they'll be considered as appreciation. But then if you take them out of that community, then it'll be considered as appropriation. Again, it's like, going back to the fact that, like, do we feel oppressed by the whole appreciation of the dreadlocks or the braids and everything else? The reason why I mentioned this is because I am a Hindu, and I have seen a lot of Hindu Sanskrit words and a lot of the our prayer items being used on the stage by various artists, and I don't feel good about it, because it's not because I feel oppressed, but I think that there's no sense of respect to my culture and to my religion. And for me, that makes a lot of difference to me. Is the respect that was given to my culture and my religion, which is more important to me than you appropriating it, I feel.
That is a very interesting perspective. In fact, that aligns with what I heard from Dr. Natasha Ramsay Jordan. This same topic, she says appreciation is really about acknowledging the roots and the background of what it appreciate. And so when we in fact she went further to say it is really about inappropriate use of the culture, right? If we acknowledge what we are using, according to her, it is appreciation, which again I think aligns with what you were talking about here, Eswari. Saying, okay, people are using this text, but maybe they are not given kudos to where they are learning it, where they are getting it from. Or in the case of European Americans who may use, who may rock braids, they are not given kudos to where it's coming from. And also they may turn a blind eye when these same folks who innovated these concepts are being oppressed. They don't stand up to say, look, you have to stop this. I think this is also a good place to talk about non-Europeans. I'm glad you brought that up, Dr. Easterling. When you mentioned this power dynamic. According to Dr. Ramsay Jordan, she also went further to explain that, look, it's okay for other groups to also use African American concepts, right? Because we they don't have the same history that Europeans have with them. But she would expect that they would also stand up and fight, stand up in the struggle, in support of when these same concepts are being used against Africans or African Americans. What are your comments on that, Dr. McDougal and then Dr. Easterling?
I agree. I think that's much more articulately put than what I was trying to say. I mean, I appreciate what you just said, because yes, that's like a situation like someone wearing a hairstyle. To me, it's a little more ambiguous about whether that is cultural appropriation or not, compared to a spiritual example, which is much more, clear about what's happening and how it's taken out of context. But those things like the involvement in standing up or seeing the people who created that cultural product as equal and not kind of treating them in an oppressive way or exaggerating their cultural product in a like distorted kind of stereotypical way. I think all of those things to me matter. So I agree 100% with what that person said. To me, I think that one of the main issues is that these situations where we come to a judgment, like about whether something's appropriate or some appropriation or not appropriation, oppressive or not, is that we need cultural learning to be integrated into our like professional certifications and licensure and all of those kind of things. Because at the end of the day, knowing about other people's culture should make us slower to come to a judgment about them. At minimum, make us slower to come to a judgment about a person, you know, or their culture.
I think this topic is very important again, because if we look back in the history, just taking a look at the African-American history in the US, we know that big lips was a caricature. The fact we have full lips, right? Was caricatured. That skin was caricatured. We would call darkies, right? And you know, voluptuous or curves and things of that sort. We're caricatured in movies and paintings in this country, on this land. But today you see a European American going to tan their skin, you know, and enjoy that. And what happens is a lot of African Americans say, look, you know, you go tan your skin and you pretend like you're appreciating this, and you rock it as if it's, you know, because you look good now that you have a tan skin, but then you can erase it. It's temporary. When it suits you, when it's no longer summer, you can unveil, remove the dark skin and become white again and fully enjoy that privilege that comes with that. And so, and African Americans are not happy about this. They look, the same thing that you curse, you enjoy, and then you remove at your will. And this is why this conversation is very important that we have. I mean, so what are your thoughts on some of these examples I just gave you? Maybe Eswari, if you jump in, but if you want to jump in, and then I'll also invite Dr. Easterling as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I come from a culture where there is a whole lot of colorism. You know, if you are fair skinned, if you are light skinned, you are treated better by society. You know, if you are darker skinned, you are not. You know, you sort of like lose out on a lot of opportunities because of the color of your skin. And back in Asia, this is a thing. You know, skin lightening creams, you know, they are big business in Asia, and ultimately we all trace it back to the fact that, you know, like the countries were all colonized by you know, like other countries, like, you know, from the UK and things like that. So it's like, you know, we become a product of what our past is. So, and fast forward is like, you know, so when I first went to the UK to study, I have like people commenting on my skin, and they say that, you know, oh my God, I love your skin. But then I'm like thinking, is like, I did not think of it as a compliment. I thought of them as like being condescending and patronizing. It's like, how dare you tell me that my skin is nice because I'm born with this. And it's like, you know, if I were to go to a store because of the color of my skin, it's like, you know, even though I could afford to buy things, you are not going to give me a second glance. You know, so I do understand where you're coming from. But yeah, it's like, you know, people tend to do that a lot. It's like, you know, and I think that, you know, sometimes I feel that subconsciously, because of like generational way or in which they have been educated, it has become part of them, and sometimes they don't even realize that they are doing it. And I see that a lot, even like here. It's like, you know, when I first moved here, it's like, you know, because of the way that I look and everything else, the first thing that they would think is like, you know, okay, she doesn't speak English, you know. And I think that, you know, people are very judgmental that way. So it goes just, it's the color of our skin is what we are born with. You're right. It's like, we can't erase it. Or it's like, and yeah, there are lots of people who go out there and try to get a tan, but then at the same time, there are a lot of people who actually like try to stay fair and light skinned because they do not want to be considered as one of us, So
Thank you for that perspective, Dr. Eastling. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, what kind of the name that kind of keeps screaming in my head is Rachel Dolezal. Rachel Dolezal, this white woman about a decade ago who, for just, lack of a better expression, appropriated Black culture. Though she went to Howard, she joined Black organizations, and she tried to wear the full clothing of Black people as much as she could, as much as claiming that she was Black. And it came out later that she was European. And the entire time she was wearing this Black costume, she was a part of African American organizations. She had a job that was slated for a Black woman, and she tried to wear it. She tried to play the entire the entire role to a hilt. And the thing is with that, she did not. It's a question of what she meant to do. Did she mean well, or was she just appropriating? Because she can always take it off and lighten her face, to not wear the dark tan makeup, and straighten her hair, or just let her hair grow naturally, and just reintegrate into society as a white woman, and just live her life out? Or was she actually trying to join the culture in order to have to impact in a positive way? Because she was part of cultural organizations, and she was helping out with Kwanzaa celebrations and all that, and it became a real odd conversation. I see you laughing, Kalu, but it became a real odd conversation. Like, okay, so she's down, but I'm offended at the same time. And that's what keeps ringing in my ear as we're talking, this Rachel Dolezal situation that came down about 10 years ago. So I just had to put that out there.
Dr. McDougal was also smiling, even though he tried to conceal he is a little bit better than mine. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. McDougal?
Yeah, see, that's exactly what I'm talking about. The context matters. And that one, she's trying to become a Black person. That's not appreciation, So that one is more clear. But the whole culture says she can do that. She can do that at will. You go, I remember the movie, I went to go see a movie, The Last Samurai. And it turned out The Last Samurai was Tom Cruise. So he goes to Japanese culture, the warriors, and he learns, and he becomes, and now he's the star of the show. He's the best. He's the samurai. He is the best samurai. He's the last, in fact, samurai, So of course she thinks she can do that. Everything tells her that she can do that, and then she can step right out of, whereas, people of African descent have to, you're compelled to, you must assimilate. The fact that you don't, all of those things, the hair, the style of dress, what you celebrate that you mentioned earlier, they all are signals that you are rejecting something. You're rejecting their program, So it lets them know that you could be a problem in some kind of a way because you're not getting down with the program. But that's not the case for them. The other thing I wanted to mention is that they don't learn all of our culture. They learn the part that they can easily adopt. They can go eat our food. They can do that. They can go to the store and eat our food. They can go and do the things that they can visually see, touch, hear, and smell. They can see our spirit, the outward manifestations of our spirituality, and they'll take like the Hindu and they'll put it on, and but they don't have to learn our values. They don't have to study our spirituality, the deeper meaning of who we are. So they do that so that they feel they can just freely engage in cultural appropriation like that, because they don't know. They truly still don't know who we are. They've never bothered to study who we are and understand it and truly appreciate us.
I think it comes down to an issue of privilege. In Dolezal's a situation, for instance, she has the privilege, the white privilege, to adopt this culture, to adopt African-American culture if she wanted to. And at the same time, she can throw it off whenever she's ready to. That's privilege. And as a white person, she has that privilege. And we had no recourse for doing anything once she exercised that privilege. All we can do is sit back and comment on it. That's privilege, that's power. Where on the other side, if a black person were to do it, it's passing, and it's passing is more of a survival mechanism. I'm trying to pass into this white world so I don't get swallowed up by it, right? And it's privilege versus passing is a much more difficult conversation to have, and I don't believe Dolezal was ever prepared to have that conversation.
You just brought up something very important on my mind. I want to turn this conversation on its head. But before I do, I want to invite Eswari. Do you have anything to say before I shift gears a little bit here?
Yeah, I think I agree with both of them in that sense that, it's like, people who appropriate it, they can turn it off at will. They don't understand the culture, they don't understand the significance of it. And I think that that's one of the things that I struggled with, because my first, I'll be very honest with you. When I was growing up, the only thing that I knew about the African American history was what I watched on TV, which was Roots. That's what I grew up with. It's like, and that was my first understanding as to the struggles of the African American history and what was like laying behind it. And later, fast forward to much later, and then I was introduced to rap music and hip hop and stuff like that. So it became like a learning point for me at one stage of my life to another. And so when I moved here, it's like, I made it my business to want to learn about the culture and everything else, because the job that I do is like, I want to be able to help my clients more. So how can I help them more if I do not understand where they're coming from? So hence it's like, I've been like talking to you about this at length, about why is it that I want to be part of this program? Yeah. So, and I think that that's very true as to what both of them are saying. I agree totally.
Again, you just brought up something else too. An example, you mentioned rap music, and there's another example there, because we know African Americans developed jazz and rhythm and blues in this country, and then it was then usurped by European Americans, and who were trying to figure out how these people were so impromptu in coming up with beautiful music, and some would argue that jazz and rhythm and blues was appropriated from the African American culture. And used without giving kudos and acknowledgement to where it came from. Again, you can touch upon that if you want, but I want to ask this question. Can people of African descent be accused of culturally appropriating other people's culture? That's a direct question. I say yes or no, and then answer, and then provide your context. I ask this because African people of African descent, do rock European hairstyle from time to time. They try to make their hair straight, right? It may not be a natural look, but they try to make it straight, right? And we also already touched upon this. Sometimes they try to look like Europeans by bleaching their skin, their skin, right? So they, in a sense, they are trying to be what they are not. Can we accuse them of also culturally appropriating, my brothers and my sister? Dr. McDougal. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Easterly.
I started to twitch when you asked that question. In that context, we have to have a different conversation because it becomes more of an issue of what is valued beauty-wise, right? And for generations, for decades, generations, centuries, dark skin, kinky hair was vilified. It was we were told that it was ugly, unkept. So this forces many of us to change how they look so they can be appreciated by those in power. That's a completely different conversation than a cultural appropriation, wearing somebody else's cultural clothes. That's a completely different conversation because now you have a point where people are breaking down who they naturally are in order to curry favor from an overbearing oppressor, and that's just a completely different conversation in my view.
Dr. McDougal?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I agree 100% with what Dr. Eastland just said, because when it's when it's like, that's assimilation. The most familiar word is what that is, when you're pressured to and expected to adopt the culture of the dominant group in a society. Assimilation. I wouldn't call that a appropriation per se, but it's also the root of like a lot of our dilemma in our own communities. So that yes, you're right. Like what you said is a lot of people of us have been taught to value other people's culture, particularly European culture, over our own, and it causes us a lot of personal anxiety, and it damages our relationships with one another because we end up looking at one another through this hierarchy of culture that values other people's culture over our own,
as well as physical pain.
Yeah, as you said, yeah.
The female perspective of this, unfortunately, I have to bring the female perspective to this conversation. So I'm going to start off with an example first. It's like I mentioned to you much earlier that, I come from a country where we have 3 races. And being the Indians, we are the minorities in the country, so it's like, we had like similar struggles of like getting access to jobs and education and things like that. So, and there was a stereotype that we have been like pigeonholed into. It's like, because your ancestors came from India, they came in as laborers into the country. So therefore, that's where you must belong. So it's like, when you try to break out of the box, then it's like, then you feel like you have to prove yourself more and more and more. And so what you do is that, you shed off things that will reinforce their stereotypes. It's like, for example, it's like, in my culture, or rather it's like, the race that I belong to, it was common for everyone to have like really long hair. It's like, and it's for them to have like all this like adornments on their head and stuff like that. I rejected it because I didn't want to be standing out in a crowd. I wanted to assimilate, and it is not because I was appropriating another person's culture or appreciating another person's culture. The way I looked at it is that I needed to live. It's like, how do I want to live? And if that means it's like, assimilating into a culture and appearances so that I don't stick out in a way that is uncomfortable for me, then I'll go ahead and do it. And after a period of time of trying, and once I become like more grounded in who I am, who the person that I am, I didn't feel the need to do that anymore. I am me. It's like, whatever that I bring to the table, it's like, you have a problem with the color of my skin, you got a problem with the way I wear my hair, it is your problem, not mine. So it's like, I do not think of it as like somebody who's like having a blonde hair or like wanting to lighten their skin and stuff like that. It's because they want to assimilate or trying to appropriate another culture. It is because like, we want to be we want to be seen as who we are. And sometimes this is all the stuff that we need to do to go and get through that threshold until we find ourselves again.
Go ahead, please. Dr. Iselin, go ahead.
Again, yeah, I argue that appropriation and assimilation are very different things, and it comes down to a question of power. And I brought up physical pain when Dr. McDougal was speaking, because when African people, both on the continent and the diaspora, are going through the process of changing their skin and changing their hair, a lot of the times it is costing them physical pain. Not to mention the psychological damage that goes into thinking that you're better if you're lighter. And I'm a lighter skinned African American, so I've dealt with that, my whole life, thinking that, some people thinking that I'm better off because I'm lighter, or I have more privilege because I'm lighter. And I have to admit that it's easier for me to walk through the world because I'm lighter skinned as opposed to someone who might be darker skinned, and that's just a fact, and I have to deal with that. But at the same time, I understand that I have no desire to lighten myself or to make myself any more acceptable to a European oppressive culture, uh, because I have no desire to be like them. But there are many of us who want to lighten their skin or straighten their hair because it helps them to move through this white supremacist world that much more easily, and that's an important issue to recognize.
Thank you very much, my brothers and my sister. I'd like to shift gears again and talk about a program that is coming up very soon. Our Marvel program is going to be starting the last week of March. It's called Marvel, My African Roots, Verified by Experience and Love. It's going to be a fantastic program where we'll be discussing some of these things, but also having a deep dive into African systems, African knowledge, African culture, African history, some of the hidden histories of African people. And I'd like for us to shed some light on that. For those who are listening and maybe interested in signing up for Marvel, you could go to osiriuniversity.org/Marvel, MARVEL. So before we talk about Marvel, I'd like to bring this discussion on cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation to a close by having our panel members maybe share some of their last thoughts on the topic. Maybe I'll go to Eswari. Do you have any last last thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I think that there has to be I think it's very difficult for us to understand the intent behind what people are saying or doing, because like a lot of the times it's like, we tend to see them very briefly and we don't try to get to know them as a person. So I think that we need to have a lot more resources for people to look at, for them to study and to learn what exactly does it mean to appreciate a culture or to appropriate it. And I think that's a conversation that's lacking here, because Nebraska, it's like being based here in Nebraska, it's like, we have a lot of migrants, and a lot of the migrants who move here is like, they do not know about the culture and the history. So for them, whatever that they see is like, whatever that they see in a rap video or like a hip hop, for them is just fashion. They don't understand the background of it, nor do they care to understand, because they're not here. They are here for a lot of different reasons, right? They're here to make a living. They moved from another country to here for a lot of other reasons. So I think there has to be greater education on this. There had to be greater understanding of it so that, we do not step on toes as we move along.
Thank you very much. Dr. Easterling?
I just believe the conversation is extremely nuanced, especially when you move the conversation beyond the U.S. borders. In the U.S., we have our centuries of issues that go into this very conversation that we could have brought up, but just for lack of time. So it's just a very nuanced conversation that you have to be careful when having, based on where you're at on this planet and where and who you are, culturally speaking.
Thank you very much. Dr. McDougal?
Yes, I would add that I think that the first place we need to start is for people of African descent across the African world and the continent and the diaspora to study our own culture and appreciate the variation among us first and foremost. That would go a long way in improving our ability to appreciate one another and to organize among one another and smooth the relationships between one another if we just studied ourselves first, and look at things like how we already exchange culture, and influence one another, the relationship between jazz and African American and Afrobeat, the exchange there, the cultural exchange between Cuban jazz and New Orleans style jazz. We already engage in so much cultural exchange, and I don't know if we appreciate that enough,
Thank you very much for an amazing discussion. It's been very eye-opening for me, and I thank you, Eswari, for sharing your perspectives. Thank you, Dr. Easterling, Dr. McDougal, for also sharing your perspectives on cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. That ends it for our dialogue. And very quickly, let's talk about Marvel, because again, it's coming up very soon. And I'd like for those of you who want to learn more about African culture to go on the website and sign up. Madam Eswari, you have signed up for Marvel.
Yes, I did.
Thank you so much for doing that. I would like to ask you, why did you sign up for Marvel?
So the reason why I signed up is because I mentioned earlier on that, I really want to learn about the African American culture and everything else that's behind it, because whatever that we learn sometimes is basically based on social media. And in social media, whoever speaks the loudest is the only sound that you hear. So I wanted to deep dive into it, and I was like reading books and all, and I look forward to Black History Month, because unfortunately that's the only time in which I have a lot of access to a lot of information, and also because I work in an organization that we help small businesses, and I want to be able to help my African American clients more, because sometimes it's like, the questions that they ask for me seems to be like, something that I can answer generically. But then if I don't understand the culture and the background that they come from, I would not be able to tailor make my responses or my advice or counseling to them to fit their purpose. And I think that this is a great opportunity. I mean, I think that I know some aspect of African American culture, but I want to do better at this. Thank you.
So you've already touched upon this a little bit, but I'd like to ask you to share more. What intrigued you to sign up? What do you hope to get out of it? But also, could you briefly describe your journey so far with regards to connecting to your African roots or to learning the African culture, if you may?
So, as you all know, I don't have African roots, but
Maybe two options.
But I have been, like I mentioned earlier, it's like, I've been very, very fascinated by the African culture. And this started from the time that I was in the UK, and I was exposed to the first Black person, and I I mean, I wouldn't have done it now in this times and age where, I will ask them whether can I touch your hair, because obviously that is very insensitive of me at that point. But I was 19, I didn't have internet, so I didn't know better. But yes, I've been fascinated by it, and I've visited some of the African countries, and I think the thing about the culture, and I'll start off with African culture first. I feel like there's a lot of similarities between the cultures, but I think that we tend to focus a lot more on the differences. And that's what intrigued me most. Is like, everyone is saying that, like Africa is this like place where it's like, nobody knows what's happening. But it's like, once you individually get to know people from each country and everything else, then you realize that there's a lot of things that actually like binds you together. And what I would want to know is that, I want to learn about these similarities. I want to learn about, if there are any differences, and there are differences. It's like, how else can I learn those differences and see if I can make a difference in my day-to-day engagement with people from the African American community and the Africans, And I know that when I traveled to some countries in Africa, I learned the language because I want to be able to communicate with them. But here and we do that regularly. It's like, when we go there, I mean, at least I do. When I go to a new country, it's like, I try to pick up like phrases that they use every now and then. But we are in a country where everybody speaks English. So it's like, it's not that, I have to like learn a special language to understand the community. It's just like, how much more do I want to like learn so that I could give better service to myself as a human, as well as to be better service as a consultant to the small businesses that I work with. And I hope that, at the end of the course, I have a better understanding. I don't know whether it's like, all my questions will be answered. And I don't even know the questions that I would have until it's like I go through the program. So I hope to add value to myself that way.
Thank you so much. We hope more people, more professionals in the US can borrow a leaf from you and want to learn more about the African culture, about the African American culture in the US, so they can better serve their constituents, serve their clients, and also just make the world a better place. So thank you so much, Eswari, for your orientation and the way in which you are approaching this. We're looking forward to having a meaningful learning experience with you. And with that, I want to say thank you all for tuning in. Thanks to our wonderful panel again. Ubuntu.
Thank you.
Ubuntu.
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 That was great. Thank you again for that. And we're going to continue to have the discussions every week. And for those of you who tuned in, audience members, continue to tune in every Saturday at this time. We're going to be having great discussions about the different aspects that affect us in the world. And go out there and live your best life. Be kind and be good to other people, and facilitate a harmonious living among everyone. That is really what we are fighting for in this world and through this channel. So thank you again. I'll see you next time.